In a city where everyone is too busy to care, Snoop Dogg's act of kindness uncovers a tale of loss, redemption, and an architect's forgotten genius. Welcome to Stories of Justice, where we bring you tales that challenge your heart and change lives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to join our mission of spreading hope and justice. The evening sky was painted in shades of amber as Snoop Dogg's luxury car cruised through the bustling streets of New York City. Inside the plush black vehicle, Snoop sat quietly, gazing out the window. It had been a long day of recording sessions, public appearances, and meetings with his label, just another day in the life of a renowned rapper. Suddenly, something caught his eye on a corner of a busy street. Amidst the sea of hurried pedestrians, an elderly man named George Sullivan was struggling. He leaned heavily on a pair of sticks fashioned into makeshift crutches. His worn-out shoes barely held together, and his clothes looked like they had seen decades of wear. Snoop couldn't look away as George stumbled, nearly falling into the street, while people brushed past him without so much as a glance. Snoop's chest tightened. "Why isn't anyone helping him?" he muttered under his breath. "Yo, man," one of his bodyguards asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Stop the car," Snoop said, his voice firm. The bodyguard hesitated. "Man, we—" "Just stop," Snoop insisted, his hand already reaching for the door handle. Something inside him wouldn't let this moment pass. The car came to a halt, causing the vehicles behind to follow suit. Security personnel scrambled, their headsets buzzing with confusion. Snoop stepped out, his imposing figure drawing curious stares from bystanders. His guards immediately formed a protective circle around him, but Snoop's focus was solely on George. George had managed to steady himself, but was visibly trembling, his frail hands gripping the sticks as if they were the only thing keeping him upright. "Yo, old G, you okay?" Snoop asked, gently, his voice cutting through the noise of the city. George looked up, startled. His watery blue eyes met Snoop's, and a flicker of recognition passed through them. I'm fine," he rasped, though it was clear he wasn't. Snoop noticed George's cracked lips and the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He reached into the car and grabbed a bottle of water from the console. "Here, take this, fam," he said, handing it to George. George hesitated, his hand shaking as he accepted the bottle. Tears welled up in his eyes as he muttered, "Thank you. Thank you so much." But Snoop wasn't done yet. He knelt beside George, oblivious to the chaos unfolding around him. Pedestrians stopped, pulling out their phones to capture the surreal scene of a high-profile rapper helping a stranger. His security team was visibly on edge, scanning for potential threats. "You got somewhere to go?" Snoop asked softly. George shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, not really. Just trying to make it to the Haven shelter before they close for the night." Snoop glanced at his guards, who exchanged uneasy looks. "We can take him there, right?" he asked, his tone more of a command than a question. "Man, it's not protocol," one of them replied carefully. Snoop frowned. "Forget protocol. This man needs help." George's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You're too kind," he murmured as Snoop helped him into the car. The guards reluctantly made room. George clutched the bottle of water tightly, as if it were a lifeline. Little did anyone know, this simple act of kindness was about to unravel a story that would touch the hearts of millions. As the car resumed its route, Snoop sat next to George, studying him closely. George's face was etched with lines of hardship, and his frail body seemed on the verge of collapse. "Yo, what's your name, G?" Snoop asked gently. "George," the man replied, his voice barely audible. "George Sullivan. George, how long you been living like this?" The question hung heavy in the air. George took a sip of the water Snoop had given him, his hands trembling. "Too long to remember," he said with a bitter chuckle. "Life doesn't always go the way you think it will." Snoop's heart sank. Here he was, a rapper born into a different world, sitting next to a man who had been abandoned by society. The contrast was stark, leaving Snoop grappling with emotions he couldn't yet articulate. The car rolled through the streets, heading toward the Haven shelter. George's eyes widened as he glanced around the luxurious interior of the vehicle. "Why would someone like you stop for someone like me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Snoop smiled faintly. "Because someone should The shelter came into view, a modest building tucked between towering skyscrapers in Midtown. As the car pulled up, Snoop noticed the line of people waiting to get in, their faces weary and hopeless. Security guards stepped out first, scanning the area before Snoop and George emerged. The crowd buzzed with murmurs as people recognized Snoop. Cameras flashed, and whispers spread like wildfire. Snoop ignored the attention, focusing on George. "Let's get you inside," he said, guiding George toward the entrance. Inside, the shelter was cramped but warm. Volunteers bustled about, distributing food and blankets. A woman behind the counter, Ms. Linda, looked up in surprise when she saw Snoop. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes flickering between him and George. "This man needs a place to stay," Snoop explained. George hesitated, clearly embarrassed. "I don't want to be a bother." "You're not a bother," Snoop assured him. "Everyone deserves a safe place to rest." Mrs. Linda smiled kindly. "We'll take care of him." As George was led away to a cot, he turned back to Snoop, his eyes glistening. "You're an angel, young man. I'll never forget this." But as Snoop watched him go, something told him this was far from over. Back in the car, he couldn't shake the image of George's tearful face. "We did the right thing, right?" he asked one of his guards, who nodded solemnly. "Yes, man, but it's unusual for someone in your position to intervene directly." Snoop sighed. It shouldn't be unusual to help someone. As they drove away, Snoop's thoughts lingered on George. There was something about him, his eyes, his demeanor, the way he spoke. It all felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. When they arrived home, Snoop went straight to his recording studio, pulling out his laptop. He typed George Sullivan into the search bar, curiosity driving him. At first, nothing significant came up, just a few common names. But as he dug deeper, an old article surfaced. The headline read, "Renowned Architect George Sullivan Vanishes After Tragedy." Snoop's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the same man? And if so, what had happened to him? Questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was certain. He needed answers. Snoop stared at the article, his pulse quickening. The George Sullivan in the article was once a celebrated architect known for designing some of the most iconic buildings in Boston, but tragedy had struck years ago. A fire had claimed his family, and George had disappeared shortly after. Snoop's mind raced. Was the elderly man he'd helped truly the same George Sullivan? If so, how had someone so accomplished ended up on the streets? He couldn't let it rest. "I need to find out more about him," Snoop whispered to himself. He printed the article and tucked it into his bag. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd return to the shelter and try to learn more. But as he lay in bed that night, sleep eluded him. He couldn't shake the image of George's weary face or the haunting sadness in his eyes. A strange sense of responsibility had taken root in Snoop's heart, and it wouldn't let go. Somewhere in the city, George was likely settling onto a cot for the night, unaware of the wheels Snoop had set into motion. Little did either of them know their paths were about to intertwine in ways neither could have imagined. The next morning, Snoop's schedule was packed, but he managed to carve out time to visit the shelter. His security team voiced their concerns, but Snoop was resolute. "I have to do this," he told them firmly. When they arrived, Snoop stepped inside, scanning the crowded room for George. He spotted him sitting at a table, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee. "George," Snoop called softly as he approached. The elderly man looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You again?" he said with a faint smile. "What brings you back here, young man?" Snoop pulled out the printed article and slid it across the table. "Is this you?" George's eyes widened as he stared at the page, his hands trembling. For a moment, Snoop thought he might deny it, but then George sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "It was me," he admitted, his voice heavy with sorrow. "A long time ago." Snoop sat down, his heart aching for the man. "What happened?" George hesitated, pain clouding his features. "It's a long story," he murmured, "one I've tried to forget." But Snoop wasn't going to let it go. "I'm here to listen." George's voice wavered as he began to speak. "I had a beautiful family. My wife, Elise, and our 2 daughters, Lila and Nora. They were my world. I built everything for them." His eyes grew distant, lost in memories. One night there was a fire. It started in the kitchen while we were sleeping. I woke up to the smell of smoke and tried to save them, but his voice broke and tears streamed down his face. I couldn't. I failed them. Snoop felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't imagine the pain George had endured. It wasn't your fault, he said softly. George shook his head. I couldn't face the world after that. I left everything behind, my career, my home, my name. I didn't deserve to live a normal life when they couldn't. Snoop reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on George's. But you do deserve it. You've suffered enough. George looked at him, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. Why do you care so much? He asked. Because no one should go through this alone, Snoop replied. Snoop left the shelter that day with a heavy heart, but a newfound determination. He couldn't let George's story end this way. That night, he stayed up brainstorming ideas, pacing his studio as possibilities ran through his mind. What if I could help him rebuild his life? Snoop thought. But how? George's pain wasn't just physical. It was deeply emotional, a wound that had festered for years. Helping him wouldn't be simple, but Snoop was determined. The next morning, Snoop approached his manager with the idea. I met someone who needs help. Real help, he explained, showing the article about George Sullivan. His manager studied the article, his expression softening. This is tragic, Snoop, he said, but helping someone in this position is a big responsibility. I know, Snoop said earnestly, but I can't just leave him like this. I want to give him a second chance. His manager nodded thoughtfully. If you're serious about this, we'll support you, but you need to be ready for the challenges. Snoop felt a surge of gratitude. With their backing, he began making calls. The plan was in motion, and it was more ambitious than anyone could have imagined. Snoop returned to the shelter the next day with news that he hoped would bring George some joy. Clutching a folder filled with information about job training programs, housing options, and counseling services, he approached George, who was sitting by the window. George, Snoop said, setting the folder on the table, I've been thinking about how I can help. These are some options to get you back on your feet. George opened the folder hesitantly, his eyes scanning the documents. This is a lot, he murmured. I don't know if I can do all this. You don't have to do it alone, Snoop assured him. I'll be with you every step of the way. George's lip trembled, and tears welled in his eyes. Why are you doing this? You could have just walked away. Snoop smiled softly. Because I believe you can rebuild your life. You've already survived so much. Now it's time to start living again. For the first time in years, George allowed himself to hope. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for believing in me. Snoop patted his shoulder. This is just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Snoop worked tirelessly to help George take the first steps toward recovery. He arranged for George to see a counselor, someone who could help him process his grief. He also connected him with a job training program that specialized in helping older adults re-enter the workforce. George was hesitant at first, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and support, but Snoop's unwavering belief in him gave him the courage to try. One day, as they walked together after a counseling session, George stopped abruptly. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd feel hope again, he admitted. Snoop grinned. You deserve to feel hopeful. You're stronger than you think. George chuckled softly, a sound that surprised even him. You're a remarkable young man, Snoop. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't have to repay me, Snoop replied. Just promise me one thing. Keep going. George nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. For the first time in years, he was beginning to believe in himself again. And as Snoop watched him take these steps forward, he knew this journey was far from over but was already changing both of their lives. Things seemed to be improving for George, but progress was far from easy. One afternoon, Snoop received a call from George's counselor. He's making strides, but he's still carrying a lot of guilt, the counselor explained. Healing takes time, and he'll need ongoing support. Snoop felt a pang of worry. He had seen George's determination, but he also knew how fragile it was. That evening, he visited George at the shelter. The older man looked tired. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had returned. Rough day? Snoop asked, sitting beside him. George sighed. I started the job training program today. I couldn't keep up with the younger guys. It felt like I don't belong there. Snoop frowned. You've been out of practice, but that doesn't mean you don't belong. You just need time. George shook his head. What if it's too late for me? Snoop placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's never too late, George. You've already proven how strong you are. Don't give up now. Though George didn't reply, Snoop could see the faintest glimmer of resolve in his eyes. The road ahead was still bumpy, but neither of them was ready to quit. One morning, as Snoop scrolled through his phone, he noticed an article featuring a photo of him and George at the shelter. The headline read, Snoop Dogg's heartwarming act of kindness goes viral. The story had spread across social media, and people from all over the world were praising Snoop's actions. While many applauded his compassion, some questioned his motives, suggesting it was a publicity stunt. Snoop felt a mix of emotions, gratitude for the support, but frustration at the skepticism. He showed the article to George during their next visit. They're talking about us, Snoop said. George glanced at the screen, his brows furrowing. I'm not sure I like this, he admitted. I've lived in the shadows for so long. I'm not used to being seen. I understand, Snoop replied. But maybe this is a good thing. People are paying attention to stories like yours. Maybe it can inspire others to help. George was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. If it helps others, then I guess it's worth it. The story's reach brought donations and resources to the shelter, benefiting not just George, but others as well. Yet for Snoop, it wasn't about the attention. It was about making sure George knew he wasn't alone. One day, George received a letter in the mail delivered to the shelter. It was addressed in elegant handwriting, and the sender's name made his breath catch, Sullivan and Associates. He hesitated to open it, his hands trembling. When Snoop arrived later that afternoon, George showed him the envelope. It's from my old firm, he said quietly. Snoop's eyes widened. Do you want to open it together? George nodded. As Snoop watched, George carefully tore the envelope open and pulled out a letter. It was from a former colleague who had read about George's story online. The letter expressed sympathy and invited him to visit the firm. They want to see me? George asked, his voice thick with emotion. Snoop smiled. Of course they do. You were one of the best in the business. They probably miss you. George looked conflicted. What if they're disappointed in what I've become? Snoop shook his head. They won't be. They'll see the same brilliant person I see. The letter marked a turning point for George, but it also tested his courage. Could he face his past and embrace the person he was becoming? Only time would tell. A week later, George stood nervously outside the doors of Sullivan and Associates, his former firm. Snoop was by his side, offering quiet encouragement. You've got this, George, he said with a reassuring smile. George nodded, though his hands trembled as he pushed open the doors. The familiar scent of polished wood and faint coffee greeted him, stirring memories he'd long buried. A receptionist glanced up, her eyes widening in recognition. Mr. Sullivan? She asked hesitantly. Before George could respond, a man in a tailored suit appeared from an adjacent hallway. George! He exclaimed, his voice filled with emotion. It was Peter, a former partner in the firm. He rushed forward and clasped George's hands. We've missed you. The reunion was overwhelming. As Peter led George through the office, more familiar faces emerged, each expressing genuine joy and relief at seeing him. I thought you'd all forgotten me, George said softly, tears in his eyes. Never, Peter replied firmly. You were the heart of this place. By the end of the visit, the firm extended an offer for George to mentor young architects, a chance to share his wisdom without the pressure of full-time work. George hesitated, but finally agreed, his heart swelling with a mix of fear and hope. Weeks turned into months, and George slowly rebuilt his life. He began mentoring at the firm, his confidence growing with each passing day. His story inspired the young architects he worked with, who marveled at his resilience and talent. Snoop remained a constant presence, visiting George regularly and cheering on his progress. One afternoon, as they sat together in a park near the Haven shelter, George turned to Snoop with a smile. You've changed my life, you know. Snoop shook his head. You changed it yourself. I just gave you a little push. George chuckled. You gave me more than that. You reminded me that life is still worth living. A group of children played nearby, their laughter echoing through the park. George watched them, his expression serene. I used to think I'd never feel joy again, he said quietly. But now I know it's possible. Snoop felt a lump in his throat. I'm proud of you, George. As they watched the sunset together, both knew that this journey had been transformative, not just for George, but for Snoop as well. Their paths had crossed at just the right moment, changing their lives forever. George's story, which had spread across social media, continued to inspire people worldwide. Donations poured into shelters, and countless others stepped forward to help the homeless in their communities. George, now a symbol of resilience, often spoke at events, sharing his journey and encouraging others never to lose hope. One evening, George and Snoop attended a fundraiser for the shelter where they first met. As George stood at the podium addressing the crowd, he paused to acknowledge Snoop. This young man saved me, he said, his voice filled with emotion. He saw me when no one else did, and because of him, I have a second chance. The crowd erupted in applause, but Snoop only smiled humbly. For him, the true reward was seeing George thrive. As the event ended, Snoop took to his social media to post a heartfelt video. If this story has moved you, he said, please consider supporting your local shelters. And if you enjoyed following George's journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us share more stories of hope and compassion. The video went viral, sparking a global movement of kindness. For Snoop and George, it was proof that even small acts of compassion could create ripples that change the world. Disclaimer: all stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. We advocate for a world where everyone has equal rights under the law and where society continues to grow in fairness, development, and civilization. Our goal is to share heartwarming stories that contribute to making life better. Any resemblance to real events, individuals, or organizations is purely coincidental and unintentional. These stories are not meant to reference any actual people, events, or entities, and contain no political or religious connotations.